A couple of weeks ago, a number of senior BJP politicians, including the Prime Minister, argued that Indians need to cut down on our consumption of petrol and diesel due to fears of global energy supplies being disrupted by the crisis in the Gulf of Hormuz. Since at least 1300 CE, Hormuz has been the hinge of Eurasian trade, where thousands of Indians, Arabs, Iranians, Mongols, and Turks made their fortunes. Goods poured through Hormuz to and fro the Mediterranean, West and Central Asia, South and Southeast Asia, and China. But in the 16th century, the Portuguese adventurer Afonso de Albuquerque took control of the port. The shockwave, just like the recent US-Iran war, rippled through the western Indian Ocean. The decades after saw the end of Hormuz's prominence, the development of Iran's first maritime policy, and the immigration of tens of thousands of Indians, traders, and investors into the Gulf and into Iran. This is a story of how Hormuz shaped the history of India and the history of the world. Just as the Gulf's geography offered opportunities throughout time, it also created challenges. Its character was completely unique, nothing like our world of monolithic nation-states. Sam Dalrymple, historian and author of Shattered Lands, described Gulf towns to me as trading islands or oasis towns wedged between the sand sea and the salt sea. They make less sense as states and more as oases filled with traders. Their population was never consistent. It waxed and waned with the trading seasons, which in turn depended on the monsoon. Now, outside of these ports, weather conditions were extreme. Storms, unseasonable winds, scorching heat and humidity. The Gulf's northern edge was shielded from the Iranian plateau by a mountain range, and it allowed very little room for coastal states to grow. Meanwhile, on the south, the vast Arabian desert was home to very small tribes that occasionally preyed on sea traffic. So, Hormuz rose to prominence because it was able to offer safe ground for international trade without the risk of piracy. This wasn't what you would think from looking at it. The island of Hormuz is barely a few kilometers across. It's sweltering, encrusted in salt, and only had one freshwater source. Its rulers solved this problem by importing water on barges from the shore. Markets were kept open all night to avoid the daytime heat. In the Persian Gulf, a political and economic history of five port cities, historian Willem Floor further explains that the rulers of Hormuz imposed an embargo on timber, ores, coir, iron, and steel, which prevented their rivals from building ships. They then took control of nearby ports, establishing a chokehold on the Gulf. Though Hormuz's rulers were Muslim, the island made no segregations on ethnic or religious lines. The second largest ethnic group on the island were Indians, who conducted a roaring trade in horses in the 13th century CE. In India's sea trade with Iran in medieval times, historian Shireen Muswi discusses the Somanatha Veeraval inscription recording the construction of a mosque in Somnath in 1264 by the Hormuz merchant Nuruddin Firoz. The Sanskrit portion of the inscription describes the mosque as a dharmasthanam and mentions the direct involvement of Gujarat's ruling Chalukya king and his officials in the grant. If this Hormuz merchant had such influence, Muswi writes, Hormuz merchants must surely have formed an elite group of some importance in the Chalukya kingdom of Gujarat. For the century after that, Hormuz continued to flourish. According to Muswi, Hormuz's networks extended as far as Uzbekistan and Turkey. Goods shipped from Hormuz reached in relays all the way to China. The Chinese admiral Chang He brought his vast armada there multiple times in the 15th century, where he exchanged ceramics and silks for the luxuries of Western Eurasia. Now, strategic resources such as horses were shipped to Iran from Hormuz. In return, India provided necessities such as rice to the Gulf ports, as well as cloth, metals, woods, and spices. In his edited volume India and the Indian Ocean, M.N. Pearson notes that exchanges overwhelmingly favored India. Vast quantities of silver and salt were required to balance this trade. In the early 1500s, though, the Portuguese erupted into the Indian Ocean. From their galleons, which were basically artillery platforms designed for deep sea and coastal voyaging, they attempted to take control of trade gateways in the Indian Ocean, especially Hormuz. They stationed a permanent garrison in the island in 1515, but immediately ran into problems. The Portuguese made completely unrealistic tribute demands on Hormuz's rulers, the equivalent of millions of dollars today. This quickly led to a backlash, forcing them to replace the island's rulers and play a balancing game between factions. Now, initially, the Portuguese were simply not numerous enough to change the patterns of Indian Ocean trade. Their Banias partners in the port of Diu continued to export cloth and spices to Hormuz, and Portuguese ships had mostly Muslim crews. But Muswi notes that extortions by Portuguese officials eventually made costs too unreasonable. At the same time, the Mughal Empire of the Indian subcontinent consolidated its reach into Afghanistan. Conquering Kandahar, the Mughals stabilized overland routes from India into Central Asia, further weakening the appeal of Hormuz. Now, according to Professor Floor, the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Iraq, attempted to get rid of the Portuguese in 1552, but they failed. It would be an Iranian power which finally expelled them and restored some normalcy to the Gulf trade, but Hormuz would never again be independent. So, up to this point, which is the 16th century, riven by internal strife, the Safavid dynasty of Iran had paid very little attention to what was happening in Hormuz, though they were technically its overlords. But Shah Abbas I, who was a contemporary of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, eventually consolidated power. He was alarmed by the loss of both Kandahar and Hormuz, which were crucial to Iran's trade with the steppe and the ocean. In the Gulf in the 17th century, historian Abdulaziz M. Awad describes how in 1622 Abbas I used a mixture of threats and promises to convince the English East India Company to attack Hormuz on his behalf. This was successful and the Portuguese stranglehold was broken. Simultaneously, Abbas recaptured Kandahar from the Mughals, re-establishing Iran as a major economic player. Abbas had learned from the mistakes of earlier Gulf rulers. Allowing foreign control over the Hormuz island would make it impossible to challenge European sea power in the strait. And so he routed Gulf trade into a tiny mainland port called Gumrun, renamed Bandar Abbas. He also encouraged the immigration of Indian merchants throughout Iran in unprecedented numbers. According to Professor Floor, about a third of all homes in Bandar Abbas belonged to Indians. There was a large temple and Hindu processions were allowed. The Banias also paid the Persian authorities to ban public cow slaughter. Historian Scott Levi, in his paper The Indian Merchant Diaspora in Early Modern Central Asian Iran, writes that 12,000 Indian merchants resided in Isfahan, the capital of Safavid Iran, which the Americans recently bombed. Now, these merchants traded primarily in cloth and luxury commodities, but used the proceeds for investments and for money lending. So they were quite favored by Iranian authorities. Quoting Levi, they provided a considerable source of income for the treasury, facilitated taxation by extending a monetized economy into the countryside, and provided village craftsmen and farmers with an important source of investment capital and credit services. End quote. But this doesn't automatically mean good relations existed between Safavid Iran and Mughal India. Trade in Hormuz fluctuated as both states competed, occasionally banning trade or rerouting it to other ports, but by this point in the 1600s, both superpowers had something approaching a modern maritime policy in which ports like Surat and Hormuz were front and center. At the beginning of this video, we saw how Gulf ports like Hormuz had conducted their own business in the 1300s. 300 years later, in the 1600s, they had become chess pieces wielded by gunpowder empires. But some patterns were deeper than the transient politics of states. Indian immigration to the Gulf continued. As the East India Company and then the British Raj expanded through the Gulf, their officials noted again and again that Indians were everywhere. English government official Thomas Herbert, who was writing in 1627 to 1630, claimed that Indians, and I quote, swarm through the Orient, pursuing trade in infinite numbers, end quote. Indians in general, not just Banias, worked as shopkeepers, brokers, bankers, accountants, translators, and secretaries. Indian craftsmen and laborers made up a huge proportion of the economy of Oman, and Indian soldiers traveled via the Gulf to fight British battles in World War I. And as Sam Dalrymple writes, it was possible in the early 20th century that Gulf states could have joined an independent India. Even after the partitioning of the Indian Ocean world into nation states, Indians continue to live and work in all echelons of Gulf society, as we spoke about in this video here. The Straits of Hormuz once made Indian fortunes both before and after the era of powerful states that looked to the sea. So what might happen now that tensions have risen again and they've been closed multiple times in the last couple of months? Quoting Aditya Ramanathan of the Takshila Institution, about 20% of oil and natural gas consumed across the world flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Even if ships heading to India aren't blocked, a major disruption in Hormuz will likely cause energy prices to spike up and make it hard to insure vessels. In a time of economic uncertainty, the last thing India wants is an oil shock. The Gulf and the Indian seaboard are not as close as they once were, but they will always be interlocked. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.